You kept us awakened. Indeed, I was fascinated by those documents. Thank you, Daniela. Thank you so much. And now is the turn to Susan Grace Galassi. She's the senior curator of the Frick collection, where she has worked since 1991, a specialist in 19th and 20th century, and she's the author and contributor to numerous publications and international exhibitions on Picasso, and has contributed to many projects as important as your book on Picasso that really transformed the field. Susan, it is a great pleasure to welcome you here again. Please, applauses for Susan Galassi.
Well, after all the expansiveness we've had throughout this program, I'm turning the focus a little bit differently to one museum, into one collector, and to look at the role of Spanish art in a museum that I think we all know and love well. But before I begin, I also want to thank the dynamic director of this institution, Roxana, and the marvelous curator, Michael Brown. I've come to San Diego many times as a visitor. This is my first time being included in your museum in a program, so I'm just thrilled to be here. Thank you so much. Now, there are two eras of intense activity in the area of Spanish art at the Frick Collection. The first, the decade of 1904 to 1914, which predates the founding of the museum and even of the house, is the time in which 8 of the 9 paintings that make up the Frick Spanish collection come in, the period that I'm referring to as the pursuit or the call. The principal figure in this era was Henry Clay Frick. Here he stands at the pinnacle of his life in the long gallery of his house and future museum, framed by paintings by Velázquez and El Greco. In a single decade, he brought in an outstanding group of works by major Spanish masters, purchasing all but one of the paintings that form a small but significant part of the collection of European Old Master and 19th century art. In acquiring Spanish art in the early 20th century, he moved beyond conventional taste of American Gilded Age collectors, who focused largely on British, Dutch, Italian, and French painting, and he allowed himself more latitude in both subject matter and expressiveness than in his purchases in works in other European schools. Frick's Spanish paintings, though relatively few in number, in my view, hold a particular weight in his holdings and in his development as a collector. His venturing into the art of the peninsula in the early 20th century, then a new frontier of Old Master art, coincided with a time of critical change in his life when he was transforming himself from a Pittsburgh steel industrialist to a New York financier and a dominant figure in the cultural arena. His pursuit of Old Master art short-circuited his arrival into the center of the circle of adventurous, passionate collectors, among them Louisine and Henry Havemeyer, as well as Archer Milton Huntington, the Altmans, and further afield, Peter Widener and Isabella Stewart Gardner in Boston, all pioneers in the chase for Spanish paintings. To this area of collecting, Frick brought both a businessman's acumen for opportunity in a rising field and an instinctive personal response. The second period of intense activity in Spanish art, the response, is the spate of exhibitions and publications around those paintings and on works by other Spanish masters not included in the collection that took place between the year 2000 and 2018. The principal figure in this upsurge of activity is the renowned Hispanist and friend to many of us here, Jonathan Brown, along with some of his former doctoral students and museum colleagues. These two eras, separated by a century, have made the Frick Collection an East Coast home for Spanish art. And in the short amount of time I can only give you a brief sketch. Before arriving in New York at the turn of the century, Henry Clay Frick had been through several previous transformations, from a clerk in his grandfather's whiskey distillery in western Pennsylvania to the founder of the Henry Clay Frick Coke Company and a millionaire by the age of 30. And then on to becoming a partner of Andrew Carnegie and to becoming the managerial head of the largest steelmaking concern in the world. His rapid rise had been accompanied by significant turbulence, culminating in his annus horribilis of 1892. In that year, he bore the brunt of the blame for the deaths of 10 steelworkers and Pinkerton guards during the infamous Homestead strike, and overnight he became the most hated man in America. He survived an assassination attempt, and tragically in that same year, he and his wife lost 2 of their 4 children. It was in this shattered state that Frick made his first visit to Spain as part of a longer European trip with his family, envisioned as a form of recuperation. In Spain, they proceeded north from Gibraltar through Andalusia, stopping to see works by Murillo in Sevillian churches, and encountering the great holdings of El Greco, Velázquez, and Goya in the Prado. 2 decades later, he owned masterpieces by all of them. Frick's exposure to Spanish art in its place of origin and to the exotic atmosphere of the country that was still off the beaten track for Americans provided an underlayer in direct personal experience to his later collecting. Richard Kagan has shown how the perception of Spain in America changed over the 19th century, from it being perceived as a backward country ruled by absolute monarchs and brutal inquisitors. This was the view that dominated the first half of the century, which gave way eventually to a more romanticized view of the country, as we see here in another painting by Goya, The Hermitage. With improvements in transportation within the peninsula, greater numbers of Americans visited, setting off what's been called the Spanish craze. Frick and his family were at part of this upsurge of interest in Spain in the 1890s in America. By the turn of the 20th century, Frick was just getting his bearings in the old master field, following his breakup with Carnegie and his gradual move to New York. In 1899, he acquired this painting, then attributed to Rembrandt, a kind of planting a stake in the territory he intended to enter and conquer. Like other Gilded Age collectors, he began by buying portraits and landscapes by Dutch and British painters. He made his first acquisition of a Spanish painting in 1904, a work that shares qualities with the Rembrandt. Both are painted in somber tones, and both are portraits of artists, Murillo's being a rare self-portrait. Murillo, like Rembrandt, had long been admired in America, although more for his religious and genre paintings. Frick's choice of a portrait was somewhat unusual. In looking at these 2 works together, we can see that there's something a little more idiosyncratic in the Spanish work. The intensity of the gaze and the unusual trompe-l'oeil framing device of chipped stone, qualities that clearly attracted Frick. The provenance would have added to its appeal as well, as it had been part of King Louis Philippe's famous Galerie Espagnole, displayed in a wing of the Louvre from 1838 to 1848. The Murillo self-portrait provided a base for Frick's increasingly adventurous purchases in Spanish art. That same year, the sugar magnate Henry Havemeyer and his wife Louisine, leaders in the pursuit of Spanish masters, as well as French modernists, dropped a bomb in the New York collecting world. They extracted from Spain, after several years of negotiation, a work of extraordinary expressive power in the person of a Grand Inquisitor to preside over their new Spanish wing. This bold acquisition set off a tsunami of collecting of works by the Greek master, whose reputation in Spain was still in the early stages of rehabilitation, having suffered a long period of obscurity. Frick was one of the first to follow the Havemeyers' lead. With his move to New York in 1905, Frick settled into one of the Vanderbilt mansions in the East 50s with a large picture gallery, and he moved his collection from Pittsburgh to New York. He told his dealer, Charles Carstairs of Knoedler and Company, that he wanted to key up his collection. And at that time, just such a painting came on the market. This allegorical portrait of Saint Jerome radiates power through the saint's gaze as he contemplates the lines of the Bible that he had translated from the Greek to the Latin Vulgate, while his long finger moves down the margin notes. In its psychological and visual intensity, it was unlike anything Frick had previously purchased. And of course, it was directly inspired in a response to the Havemeyer cardinal. The painting's journey to New York was a fraught one, abandoned in a storeroom for nearly a century in the Cathedral of Valladolid. It was resurrected in the mid-19th century and restored. And then, in the early 20th century, it was put up for sale by the church authorities in order to buy an organ. A dealer whisked it off to France, where it passed through Knoedler's Paris gallery and then on to Frick. Its departure set off an uproar in Spain, and new laws were passed to protect the country's patrimony. With St. Jerome, Frick made a leap from industrialist outsider to a discriminating and adventurous contender in the old master field, bringing to America the fourth or fifth work by El Greco. In 1908, at the urging of Charles Carstairs of Knoedler and Company, Frick bought this small painting, Queen Maria Theresa, the future wife of Louis XIV. But in the area of Spanish art, Frick was looking for works with greater impact, and this work did not stick. Spanish art was quickly becoming an established field on the East Coast, and the stakes were higher. A year later, he made a second, this would be 1909, Frick made a second and last trip to Spain, this time on a buying mission. And he found what he was looking for in El Greco's oil sketch for the purification of the temple, the painting in the National Gallery, which we saw yesterday in Gabriele's talk. He bought it from the dealer and expert Aureliano de Berruete, the future director of the Prado. Here, as with St. Jerome, Frick went out on a limb, buying a work of religious subject matter, an area in which he rarely ventured, that is far more dynamic, colorful, and turbulent than any previous work he had purchased or would purchase in the future. Indeed, for one of the world's leading capitalists, the image of an enraged Christ overturning the merchant's table as the apostles look on seems like an odd choice. What meaning he attributed to it, we don't know, as Frick rarely commented on his acquisitions. But it was clearly personal. Once he moved into his Fifth Avenue house, he hung it upstairs in the family room in a specially carved niche over the fireplace. The connection of the painting to a major work in the National Gallery, as well as the fact that it had been owned by the son of King Louis Philippe, would no doubt have added to the appeal. In 1911, Frick acquired Velázquez's extraordinary portrait of Philip IV, arguably the greatest painting by the master in North America. The work not only had a royal provenance, but it is a portrait of a king and Velázquez's patron over decades. Known as the Fraga Philip, it passed through various branches of the Bourbon family, reappearing on the art market in 1910 from the collection of Elias of Bourbon Parma. The price was enormous, and it took a consortium of dealers to sell it. Frick, however, did not hesitate to pay $475,000 for the work, a record for Spanish art on this side of the Atlantic. This work propelled Frick to the top of the field of old master collectors, not only of Spanish art, but of European art in general. He must have taken great satisfaction in knowing that the version of the work in the Dulwich Picture Gallery, once thought to be the original, was now considered a copy of his canvas, the prototype for other versions. What greater validation could there be for a collector? In the context of building his new house at 1 East 70th Street, with a picture gallery to fill, and again needing to key up his collection, Frick bought his third painting by El Greco. This time, by this time, El Greco was no longer a new old master. Yet, as with other Spanish works, Frick made an unusual choice, branching out into a less recognized period of his art, his Roman years that preceded his move to Spain. This swaggering sergeant major in half armor with a sunburned face is distinctly different from the attenuated figures of a Spanish period, with their aura of mysticism. Once again, Frick appears to have been drawn to the powerful expressiveness of the figure. This work, like several of Frick's other Spanish paintings, passed through King Louis Philippe's Gallery Espagnole and then on to a prominent British collection. Frick had not yet been successful in acquiring a major work by Goya, whose work could be seen in many New York private collections as well as museums by that time. In 1910, he briefly considered this full-length portrait, but did not purchase it. He bided his time for a work of extraordinary power, pouncing in 1914 on The Forge, an extraordinary painting that remains unique in his collection as the only genre work and the only work that deals with the subject of labor, specifically that of iron workers, a subject about which he could not have been neutral. This work is, of course, tied in with Frick's origin story, the source of his fortune in steel that underlies the collection. Acquired just at the time of moving into his house on Fifth Avenue, it can also be seen as symbolically connected to the forging of Frick's future museum and gift to the public, the final stage of his transformation from a robber baron to a cultural Maecenas. As Frick would later say, "I want this collection to be my monument." That same year, he acquired two more works by Goya, this understated masterpiece dating from his last years spent in exile in Bordeaux, when he pared down in form, color, and brushwork to the fundamentals of representation. And this intense portrait of the Conde de Teba, a highly prized work at that time, which he acquired from Lázaro Galdeano. It's the last of Frick's acquisitions in Spanish art. Over one decade, from 1904 to 1914, Frick assembled a small group of Spanish paintings of very high quality, among them some of the greatest works by El Greco, Velázquez, and Goya in America. In Spanish art, Frick branched out from the serene landscapes and grand manner portraits by artists of other European schools that make up much of his collection, selecting more expressive, disruptive works and subjects that bring an element of surprise to the collection. Through Spanish art, still a new frontier, Frick established himself as a major figure at the cutting edge of old master collecting in New York and its vicinity. But you might say, where is that other master that his competitors went for? Zurbarán. While other collectors pursued works by Zurbarán, there's no evidence that Frick was offered any or that he sought them out. It is unlikely that he would have been drawn to the meditative monks or martyrs, even if these works had been on the market at the time. But I think that if one of San Diego's 4 gems by Zurbarán that makes this museum the home of Zurbarán in America had been on the market, Frick might have snapped it up. Following Frick's death in 1919, a large number of works from across the European schools were added to the collection. However, there was only one from the Spanish school. That's the Duke of Osuna, which came as part of a block purchase from the son of J.P. Morgan. From World War II to the new millennium, Spanish art at the Frick settled down for a long, long nap. And that brings me to the response. Here we see Jonathan Brown in a photo in front of El Greco paintings from one of our exhibitions. In the late 1990s, Professor Jonathan Brown of the Institute of Fine Arts and a member of the Frick's advisory board offered his expertise in organizing exhibitions around the dormant Spanish masterpieces. Many of his former students had by that time fanned out into museums throughout the US and Spain. Many are here tonight. And exhibitions of Hispanic art were on the rise. From 2000 to 2018, 9 exhibitions of Spanish art were held at the Frick, with publications, symposia, and lecture series. This new Spanish craze was supported by 4 directors, curators, and scholars within the Frick and outside, the Frick Art Reference Library, as well as by Jose Luis Colomer, a philanthropic publisher and a passionate promoter of Spanish art and scholarship. Now, we have only time to touch briefly on some of these exhibitions, but I will run through them with you. The first was Velázquez in New York Collections, organized by Jonathan Brown and Marcus Burke, curator at the Hispanic Society of America, as well as Edgar Munhall at the Frick. The king's portrait was now brought together with that of his powerful minister, the Duke of Olivares, from the Hispanic Society, 2 works that had entered New York collections within a year of each other. Along with other works from the Met, the show was really a mini retrospective of Velázquez's work as a portraitist. In El Greco Themes and Variations of 2003, we brought together variations on the Frick's St. Jerome and the Purification of the Temple from London, Minneapolis, and Madrid. The focus of this show was El Greco's workshop practice and his recycling of compositions over long periods of time. This show was followed by Goya's Last Works, which focused on the artist's final years in Bordeaux, demonstrating his irrepressible innovation across 4 media, including his miniatures on ivory. Many loans came from the Prado as a result of Jonathan's close relationship with Gabriele Finaldi. Let's see, am I out of order? Okay. Let's see what I have, Men in Armor. Oh, I'm a little out of sync. Okay, and then on the bottom, the Spanish Manor, which was one of the first exhibitions of Spanish painting in America. It brought together sheets by Goya, Ribera, and Murillo with many artists who were very little known to the New York public. This also was organized with the Hispanic Society by Jonathan Brown and Lisa Banner. And then there were small dossier shows such as Velázquez, The King at War, an exhibition by Pablo Perez Dorce, one of our fellows. It brought together a technical study of the work carried out by Michael Gallagher at the Met, and a fresh iconographic analysis of the work by Perez Dorce, placing the painting in the context of its first audience in a Catalan church in Madrid. Men in Armor was again a small dossier show organized by a doctoral fellow, Jung-Ho Park, who paired the Anastasi portrait with a very similar work by the leading Roman portrait painter of the time, the model of the type of work that he aspired to, exploring the similarities and differences between them. More recently, there was Murillo, the self-portraits. This was a show organized by Xavier Solomon and Letizia Treves, a curator at the National Gallery, a show that brought together the Frick version of self-portrait with the later version that we saw yesterday, which is in the National Gallery, as well as with other portraits and figurative works. A little bit later, Marilyn McCulley and I decided to push the limits a little bit, just like Frick had himself, and we organized a show of Picasso's drawings, that omnivore artist who had cannibalized all of the past, in an exhibition of drawings from 1890 to 1921. I argued with the Frick that even though we didn't have a Picasso in the collection, all of the collection was in Picasso. And it worked. And most recently, there was the artist that got away from Frick's collecting. With the Meadows Museum and Auckland Castle in Durham as our partners, we presented the Old Testament series, Jacob and His 12 Sons, a show that cut across Jewish, Muslim, and Christian faiths and opened the way to Latin America, the original destination for the works that ended up in Northeast England. Perhaps with the expansion of the Frick's physical plant over the next several years, we will expand as well our concept of the Hispanic world, following in Michael's footsteps, to include the global empire. But that will be for another generation. Thank you.